Well, you're asking about a very specific dispute about marriage, divorce, and remarriage among the churches of Christ. I haven't talked about that subject in a long time, so I want to be a bit more broad in explaining different views outside of the Church of Christ and then moving to the specific. So, we're all familiar with the Roman Catholic idea that uh, you can never divorce your spouse for any reason. Your only avenue of dissolving a marriage is to have an annulment. Essentially, you were never married. A great number of churches have no specific doctrine about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. You can divorce any number of times or get remarried any number of times. There's just nothing to it. We don't want to have any doctrines that get involved in people's lives, that sort of thing. Some more conservative denominations will say things like, well, if you've been divorced, you can't be a minister, which is a misunderstanding of 1 Timothy 3, applying the qualification of elders to ministers. Some do say you can divorce your wife if she's either unfaithful, Matthew 19, or if an unbelieving spouse abandons you, which I think is a misunderstanding of 1 Corinthians 7. And a lot of times they're centered around divorce. They don't have any rules about remarriage. Now, specifically for how churches of Christ understand marriage, divorce, and remarriage from Matthew 19. You cannot divorce your spouse unless they commit sexual immorality. Some say adultery. I think if you really ask people, would you really ask them, well, does it have to be intercourse or can it be some other kind of unclean act? And there are some that argue that if you look at pornography, then you're committing adultery in your heart, and that would be grounds for marriage. A lot of people don't agree with that. So for sake of time, we'll just say that committing adultery, you can divorce your spouse. And if you divorce your spouse because they committed adultery, you can marry another. But if you committed adultery and were divorced for that reason, you cannot remarry. Now, both sides of this particular debate you're asking about believe that you must marry someone and be joined to them for life. You can divorce them. You don't have to divorce them if they are unfaithful. And if someone is divorced because they were unfaithful, then they cannot remarry. Where this gets complicated is if someone becomes a Christian and they're in one of those marriages, or if just any kind of scenario you can think of where they weren't aware of the teaching or they weren't aware of this doctrine. And the classical argument was, well, if they're baptized, their sins forgiven, so they can be married, even if it was unscriptural to begin with, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to a lot of people, but it is a way around it. So one side in this debate is saying, if you are unscripturally married, if you have no right to marry them in the first place, that being married to them is committing ongoing adultery, and that marriage must be annulled, as it were. It's essentially a divorce, but it must be annulled, regardless of the situation, regardless of how long you've been married in this unscriptural marriage, and children or no children, you must still take care of those children. Some people allude to the Ezra example, even though that's Old Testament, of priests that had to put away their wives but still care for their children. The other side of this particular specific debate is that the adultery is not ongoing. If someone recognizes they're in a marriage that was not scriptural, that all they can really do is repent of it and keep their vows and move on, move forward. I'm going to get some heat for saying this, but I think both views are conservative when it comes to Matthew 19, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The question is, if someone is in that relationship, should they dissolve or should they not? Even though that, like we've already covered, there's a lot of complications and things and questions people have about this. Now, if the people who say you must dissolve the marriage are right, telling them that they don't have to dissolve the marriage could affect their salvation. And if the people who say you don't have to dissolve the marriage are right, then people are splitting up marriages that, God will recognize if they recognize we're not in a good place, and you're tearing asunder what God has joined together. So the disagreement is primarily about the tense of the Greek words and the application of what do you do with people who are in this kind of situation. So I hope that helps.